Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to the 8th session of this course. Today we're going to be talking about consequentialism, and we've already spoken about utilitarianism, which is a form of consequentialism, and we're going to be speaking about how that is so. And in the previous session we spoke about deontological ethics, which in many ways is the opposite of consequentialism, or the main competitor to consequentialism. So before we start, we're going to read, as per tradition, the parts of the poem which is applicable here.
فصل في نظرية العواقبية ورد ما ينهجه العواقب مهمل قصد قاصد وخاطب بأنه ليس له تفريق بين الذي بسيفه يريق دما بظلم وطبيب عالج لجرح مجروح وبعد الموت جاء لأن ما قد عمل أمات أمت بذا منهجهم مماتا.
Right, so consequentialism. What is consequentialism? We have some kind of a definition here in the first slide, so let's read that. Of all the things a person might do at any given moment, the morally right action is the one with the best overall consequences. To put this in more succinct terms, if action X causes Y consequence, then X action is morally justified. Now, this, as we've kind of just alluded to in a second ago, is the opposite of deontological ethics. Deontological ethics says that an action has intrinsic value. You're doing it because it's good in and of itself. Okay? You don't lie because lying is wrong in and of itself. You don't break promises because breaking promises is wrong in and of itself. You don't waste your talents, he said, Kant said, because wasting your talents is wrong in and of itself. You don't commit suicide, Kant mentioned, because committing suicide is wrong in and of itself. Why did Kant come to this conclusion? Because he used a categorical imperative and a universalizing maxim. He said, if everyone in society does this, for example, lying, it will cause an impossible, dysfunctional society. Therefore, the action in and of itself is wrong. Now, the consequentialist will say this is problematic because there are examples where, for example, the lie example that we gave in the previous session, that the consequences of said action can cause a more severe outcome. For example, if you don't lie sometimes, then you can die. Like we see this, actually, it's not an abstract thing. It's not hypothetical. We see people, for example, being forced to say, I believe my God is Bashar al-Assad or something, or if you don't say this, we'll shoot you to death, or say that Krishna is your God or something. These Muslim minorities are being persecuted in India, and obviously they don't believe that that is the case, but if you don't say this, we'll kill you. Now, on this ethic, you can't say that on this ethic, and in any way, shape or form, the deontological ethic. But the consequentialist ethic will say, actually, the consequences of not saying this is death, and therefore it's completely justified for you to lie at this point, which we would agree with, of course, as Muslims, because we do have, as we'll come to see, what I refer to as Sharia consequentialism. There are aspects of the Sharia which accord with a certain consequentialism. However, the question is, when it comes to consequentialism, what is the base and what differentiates consequentialism from utilitarianism? Utilitarianism, let me ask the question, what are the two things which we must consider when making a decision on utilitarian grounds? That's true, but before that there's something more fundamental. Pain and pleasure, okay? So you have two lords, Bentham said. You have the Lord of pain and you have the Lord of pleasure. And then, as you've mentioned, we discover what is the greatest pain, greatest pleasure for the greatest number of people. So you've got two steps. You've got what pain and pleasure is, and then you call it desirability for the sake of argument, and then you've got, the greatest good for the greatest number. Now, it doesn't have to be that you start with desirability. You could start off by talking about welfare. You could start off by talking about, instead of it being pain and pleasure, you can replace pain and pleasure with anything and still have a consequentialist ideology. So you can say, if it's about economic growth, we are trying to create economic growth. So anything which creates economic growth, the ends justify the means, for example. So the reason, what differentiates utilitarianism from consequentialism more generally, is that utilitarianism very strictly starts off with desirability as the premise, whereas consequentialism can replace desirability with anything else. Can replace it with economic growth, can replace it with, we want a society where we see the maximum number of X in society. You know, families. You can have family consequentialism. You can have, you know, just fill in the gaps. You can have something, right? It doesn't have to be pain and pleasure directly. So that's what differentiates utilitarianism from consequentialism. In a sense, consequentialism is the master key category, and underneath it you have utilitarianism. So utilitarianism, all utilitarians are consequentialists, but not all consequentialists are utilitarians. Very straightforward, okay? Now, there are different types of consequentialism. So there's 4 here, which I've mentioned in the slides that you can see. Rule consequentialism, dual consequentialism, egoistic consequentialism, friendly consequentialism. Now you can read those definitions in your own time, but obviously all of those different types of consequentialism start with a different premise. Egoism is it's an ideology in and of itself which we'll cover by itself. Egoism is the idea, ethical egoism, that you should do whatever is in your best interest. This is propounded by someone like Ayn Rand. She's a woman who had different philosophies, but this was one of them. She was an ethical egoist. So anything that is it's the opposite of altruism. Anything that is in your best interest, that's the good thing to do. So ethical egoistic consequentialism is an expansion of that now. But there you can have, as John Mackey mentions in his book, with this you can have contradictions, because sometimes you want something, but it's in contradiction with what someone else wants, and so the consequences for the majority can sometimes conflict with the consequences for the individual, and these are the kinds of tensions that you may find in consequentialist ideology. Now, what I want you to think about with the person next to you right now are the merits and demerits of consequentialism. What do you think makes sense about consequentialism, especially in conjunction with what we studied last week or on Saturday? What do you think makes sense about consequentialism? And what do you think are already the weaknesses of consequentialism? Let's try and get the synapses working, and let's activate the schemata, and let's speak to the person next to us, and let's have 3 minutes, and then we'll come back and see what you guys have to say. Okay, go ahead.
The Robin Hood, I think you can say. So if you have a majority of poor people and to feed them, you're going to steal from the rich or do something that's against the law. That's a form of consequentialism, I'd say. The ends justify the means.
Yes,
is that correct?
This is actually is mentioned in the literature quite often, actually. But consequentialists do have a reply to this, and the reply that they usually use is that if the consequences of theft, for example, as a whole to the society, are worse than the money that you'd be given the poor people, because a society that has plunged into like anarchical system of people stealing from each other is worse than, so that they'll make that argument. But this is definitely a very valid point, and I don't see why you can't make the argument as a consequentialist that, you know, theft, because the ends justify the means, theft can be at least acceptable in some circumstances. Maybe not in all circumstances, but in some circumstances. And you can see the compatibility, therefore, between consequentialism and socialism, for example, or even communism. You know, it's not incompatible for consequentialism to be coupled with one of those two left ideologies. Well, we do have, by the way, sessions on Marxism as well. So,
if they say, like, the term was, I think you mentioned tyranny of the majority.
Yes.
In this case, it would be tyranny of the minority, where you've got a small amount of people who's hoarding all the money. That in that case, that consequentialism would be valid.
Yeah. So this is, and there's arguments to be made on both sides. So the economic arguments that are made are usually made between supply side economists, okay, and what we call Keynesian economists. So supply side economists, of which Margaret Thatcher was one, for example, right? The argument she made, which is not completely false, but there are some issues of it which are, you know, there are problems with it, is that when the GDP of a country gets bigger, so in other words, when you have more rich people in a country, absolute poverty is diminished more. Relative poverty, of course, is exacerbated. So if Yeah, so trickle-down economics.
Yeah.
They call it trickle-down economics for that reason. So, but it's interesting because both kind of left-leaning politicians, as well as kind of like, you know, right-wing economists, or really liberal economists, yeah, supply-side economists, they both make an argument from consequentialism. Both of them make the same argument. One of them is saying that the consequences of a socialist type structure, like the Keynesian model, is better, and some other ones like Thatcher, yeah, Adam Smith, obviously he's a philosopher, and they would make the argument that if there are rich people in the house, imagine the house as economy. If there's rich people in the house or in the family, then the whole family gets richer, even though there's more inequality between family members.
They're better off.
Yeah, he's saying that the whole country gets better off.
So what did a consequentialist say to, you know, he said the tyranny of the majority.
Minority, he said.
No, yeah, but the tyranny of the minority is caused because of the tyranny of the majority, because they're not spreading the funds as they should, which is causing the tyranny of the minority having to have people like Robin Hood.
Yeah, so that's what a socialist would argue. That's what someone like left-wing economist or Keynesian economist would argue. Marx would argue that, of course.
Yeah.
But his argument is more sophisticated than that. It's much more sophisticated than that. And that's why it needs a separate treatment. We have a separate treatment for Marx. In fact, his one's one of the most difficult ones that we're going to cover, yeah, because it requires real thought. He has a different starting point. Yeah, Marxism is not as easy to deconstruct as some of these other ones. So, yeah, anything else from this side? Merits and demerits, by the way, we're talking about.
Yeah, so we said one of the merits was that it gets rid of all of the problems of absolutism kind of thing. So basically all of the negatives from deontological ethics are kind of solved through this.
Yeah, it's a very straightforward, it's a low-lying fruit, and it's correct. So, for example, some of the things that we saw, the tensions that we saw with deontological ethics, for example, you can never lie, but what in a situation where someone's about to die and so on, that is solved, in a sense, because we do consider the consequences with this ethic.
What about demerits? Or like, for example, if someone says I'm a consequentialist, and then can we say to them that, okay, so to your worldview, you will accept that, for example, America bombing Nagasaki and Hiroshima to kill civilians to protect their own people? Yeah,
no, but this is difficult. I wouldn't use that example. The reason why I wouldn't use that example is because you can make arguments for and against, just like the economic example. Because if they will say, look, there's nothing that justifies the killing of that many people, and in fact, a nuclear attack like this, which could merit a response, okay, that is the consequences for society are overall in the negative. So a consequentialist could as easily say, okay, that this is not good on consequentialism. You can make an argument for consequentialism that is good on consequentialism. The missing component here is as follows, yeah? No one knows the future. This is the missing component. Like, I don't know what's going to happen in the future, okay? And because I don't know what's going to happen in the future, I don't know if I do action X, whether that's going to have consequence Y or not. So what people have to do in society and economy and politics and so on, even in family, is that they actually have to weigh things up. And that's a very natural thing to do. How probable is it that if I do X, that Y will happen, negative consequence? On the flip side, how probable is it that if I do Y, Z will happen, positive consequence? And this is the difficult thing that we all actually do in our daily lives. I mean,
the thing is, the example he puts, like, it was to prove that consequentialism it can be wrong. So we know that Nagasaki and Hiroshima were bombed, knowing that Japan is already surrendering.
Right.
So there was no point to.
But we have hindsight. Now we can look back.
Yeah.
But when you're basing morality on consequentialist ethics, you're basing it in a future sense.
Yeah, but you can use consequences. You can use
the
the
past.
Idea.
Yeah. That's the only thing you can use, right?
So, but I can do something wrong and then use it against just to justify. Say, look, this was part of the.
Yes.
It was part of the plan.
Yeah.
I had to do it.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah, it makes sense. Yes, it does.
Maybe it wasn't needed.
Yeah. Exactly. You can always justify backwards, as well. Yeah, you're right about that. But what I was going to say was, there's something more fundamental here that we need to think about, right? We said that the predicate base of consequentialism is, say, on utilitarianism we said it's pain and pleasure, right? But on other systems, like for example, if we talk about welfare, economic growth, whatever it is that we're saying we're going to start with, the question is going to always be, why should we start with that? Like we did with utilitarianism, right? We said it's pain and pleasure are the two most important things. They're the gods. That's what Bentham said. Yeah, pain and pleasure are the two gods. Okay, why? Why? David Hume, interestingly, he said something. He said that if you ask someone why they don't like pain, there's no answer after that. He said if you ask someone why you don't like pain, they will have. It's such a base level thing that you don't need to have an answer for it. And there is some truth in this statement. We're not disagreeing with that. It is very instinctive to believe that pain is bad because it hurts you. Yeah? Or in fact, you can say it because it hurts me, right? But
Is that the ontological ethic? Does that fall into the?
no, this is more consequentialism. We're still on consequentialism now.
Okay.
What we're saying is, what are the things that we're relying on the consequences of? What are we trying to achieve? Are we trying to achieve economic growth? Are we trying to achieve, okay, the barometer for our success is how many stable families there are in a society, how many hospitals there are in a society, how many kitchens there are, whatever it is. Whatever you start off with and say, well, if I want X, then anything which goes against this in consequence, negative, or goes for it in positive consequence, is a step towards the right direction. Whatever X is, whatever this thing we're starting with, how can that be justified? I want economic growth. Why should we want profit maximization over even revenue maximization? I mean, there's a difference, by the way, in economics. Why should we want desirability over a stable society?
What about maximum pleasure? Why is that the bar? Why is it?
Yeah, exactly.
Because we talked about the consequences of that, of pornography, alcohol. It is maximum pleasure, but that's coming at consequences, which we see. I was reading a book called Irreversible Damage.
Yeah.
And it was talking about how, depression and suicide in a lot of girls, for example, as well, have increased. So we live in a society with maximum pleasure, but we're not seeing fruits. We're seeing rotten fruits. So can we not say that your bar is maximum pleasure, but now it's coming at the cost of people having pain?
You could say that,
Yeah.
absolutely. You can say that,
Yeah.
absolutely. But you can. What's even easier is to ask them, why should it be maximum pleasure?
Why?
Yeah, why? It's just a simple question of why. Like, why should it be this? Like, you ask a socialist, why should it be equality in economics? You ask a supply-side economist, why should it be economic growth? They all have an answer, because this is a better society, it's more fair, it's whatever. Then you keep asking why, then you've got problems, because the level of justification will get harder and harder. Then you have to get something which is a meta-ethic, if you like, that's going to explain this, which in most instances you won't have such a thing.
So what would they say if I said, for example, like, why maximum pleasure? And they said, because it brings happiness.
That's a circular argument. This is exactly what we found.
What would they say? Like, imagine you're speaking to. What would they usually say? What's their argument?
Well, we don't deal with what the lay people say. We deal with what the heads of this movement
what
say.
would the heads say?
So who remembers on utilitarianism? You were here with utilitarianism. Were you here?
Was that Saturday?
Yeah, I think you weren't here.
Not Saturday, no.
So who remembers the justification that Mill used?
Secularism is like it's desirable because you desire it, kind of thing.
Yeah. He was saying that desirability is desired because it's desired. It's desirable.
Is that what he said?
Yeah. But the thing is, the only way this can make sense is if we differentiate between desirability and desire. Now, if we differentiate between desirability, which is the is and the ought, that it ought to be desired, then now you have the naturalistic fallacy, which we talked about. We have the how do you get from the is to the ought? Something is the case to how it should be the case. What David Hume referred to as the naturalistic fallacy. Because you can be a certain way, it doesn't mean you should be. You can be a certain way, it doesn't mean you should be that way. Like, for example, if you say, I was born gay. Okay, I was born gay, doesn't mean you should be gay. No, this is a good, because if you say, I was born gay, therefore I should be gay, That's a naturalistic fallacy, according to David Hume. If I was born gay, therefore I should be gay. Or if I was born incestuous, if we take the Oedipus complex seriously, then therefore I should be. That jump is an unjustifiable jump. That is a fallacy, in fact. That is a statement filled with falacity. So you word there for the people. Not felicity. That's something else. You know, but you see what I'm talking about here. So the is or, and that's why it's very important to, it's just an infinite regress of justification. There's going to be a bottomless pit of no answers. And so we have to question what the premise is. What are the consequences? Look at Sam Harris. He's not even in the literature, by the way, because he's not a ethicist or something like that. But he's made a little book about, and he's talking about consequentialism and stuff, but welfare and these things. But once again, why should we have that? And then he's going to have some kind of circular justification, just like Mill did. They all have some kind of circular justification, just like Mill did, because there's no way out. We should have it because we like it, because it's good. Oh, it's good because it's good, basically. Is that what you want to say? It's good because it's good. That's circular argument. That's circular argument 101. Yes.
Couldn't like a better response on their side be, like maybe like going to like a more biological level, where you say that pleasure is desired because because it leads to our survival as a species.
But why is survival good? Why should we? You see, you've moved from is to ought. You're assuming that survival is a good thing. It's not necessarily assumed in ethics that it is a good thing. That's why is it a good thing? Or because evolutionarily, there's two things that are
Can
there.
you say that existence is just better than non-existence? Like being able to exist and being able to survive and continue to live is just better.
No, you couldn't, because Hitler, his non-existence is better than his existence, for example. And if we had a world full of Hitlers, then you could, and on consequentialism, right? But even forget about Hitler. That premise itself would be difficult to prove. Why is existence better than? Better than in what sense? In the sense that it's morally superior. But if you say it's morally superior, then you're already begging the question. So you're assuming the premise in the conclusion. Yeah.
What about if there's like, there's that guy who comes to Speaker's Corner and he says like, stop having kids. Have you seen him?
Well,
Yeah, you remember that guy?
No.
He comes in, he's like, you shouldn't have kids because this world is full of,
Antinatalism,
like,
yeah.
Yeah, and then he's like, there should be no existence. So he can argue that, innit?
Yeah, it's good that you brought that up. I mentioned this before. Peter Singer, who's a utilitarian, he actually wrote that disabled children can be killed because the pain is more than pleasure. It's kind of like that, yeah. But it's the pain is more than the pleasure and stuff like that. And there's all these comparisons between humans and animals, and black people and slavery and animals and stuff like that he makes in his public, because he thinks it's all the same thing. But there was one thing that I saw Peter Singer do that, just a tangent, but that I found interesting, and I used it in one of the fundraising, because for him he's a consequentialist, right? He's a utilitarian, and he said he made this TED talk, where in the background he had like he said, if a child died right outside this place that they're in, yeah, is it any different to someone dying 3,000 miles away? And he showed some kids in, I don't know, whatever country it was, and he said basically, on my worldview it's the same. The truth is, I mean, we can go into the technicalities, but I used that for a fundraiser one time. I said, look, were you there?
Yeah, lots of hands up.
Yeah, we had lots of hands up that day. We had a lot of money. Yeah. So anyway, point being, long story short, how do we prove the premise? You can't. It's unprovable. And therefore, it's better to get them to justify themselves than for us to try and justify ourselves. That's the golden rule, isn't it? It's always better to put someone on the back foot than be on the back foot. And that's something Anthony Joshua should have learned before he went in for Usyk. That's what he should have known. Okay? All right. Now, let's quickly go to the next bit of this. So these are some of it's from the I don't know, it's the encyclopedia, the online one, the famous one. This is some of the arguments of full consequentialism, right? Actions are transient things, soon gone, but basically the results are going to stay forever. Really, is that an argument? Not really. They say, well, maximizing goodness is always better than not maximizing goodness. But once again, why and how? And there's not really good arguments there. Arguments against consequentialism. But what about family bias? Like, for example, and we'll mention this, it's actually mentioned in the poem as well. Like, if you've got two kids drowning in the sea, one of them is your own child, and one of them is another person's child. Okay? Now, you've only got the resources to save one of them. Which one should you save? Now, we would say you have a family allegiance, that you should save your own child first. If they're the same age and the same whatever, right? And then if you have time, you go for the other child. Whereas a consequentialist, or even an individualist, doesn't have the liberty to make that kind of claim. Because on what basis are we prioritizing family kinship ties over not prioritizing them? The consequence of this child dying is the same as this child dying. You see? So there's no reason to favor X over Y. So it puts into question things like family ties. Why are you even providing for your family, not the giving charity? Some will say, well, actually, if you don't provide for your family, your mental health will not be in order, therefore you won't be able to do it. And these are good arguments, but no problem. The same problems still apply. Like, you can't really justify family ties in that sense, and in the kinship and community ties and patriotism and all these kinds of things. You can't really justify in consequentialism in a very clear way. What about good intentions? And this goes back to the poem. Like, because if everything is to do with your intention, if everything is to do with the consequences, then what about the intention? And what's mentioned in the poem, or the Sheikh mentions, is like, for example, what differentiates the surgeon cutting the person being operated on with a lancet, with a surgical tool, versus the criminal putting the knife in someone's belly? It's only the intention that differentiates the two things. But if consequences are the only important thing, and intentions are not, then really these two are the same. Or to bring it closer to home, we can say this. The one who commits manslaughter and the one who commits murder. Like, if I run some kid over because I'm driving erratically and I didn't mean to run him over, it has the same consequence as if I wanted to kill that kid with my intention. So if we eliminate the intention, we have a real problem here, because now we're putting manslaughter and murder in the same category. Imagine this, a society with this kind of logic. Imagine what kind of, but they would probably argue, that itself is a consequentialist understanding. That because not putting intentions into the equation. But then consequentialism is all about the thing itself having no intrinsic value. So it's all about the consequences. So on a purely consequentialist level, it's the same thing. Manslaughter and murder are the same thing, because they have the same consequence.
Couldn't they say though that the effects on the family after you've murdered them is different if it was manslaughter? So there'll be more consequences if you murder them than if they were just slaughtered.
Yeah, they can make those arguments. For sure they can make those arguments, definitely. But on a purely numerical level, like, the family is going to be upset either way.
Yeah.
You see? I mean, premeditated murder versus non-premeditated, like, the family might feel the same way. If the person's being murdered because of an act of passion versus the person was calculating it before and thinking about how to do it. These things are all demarcated in law, and for good reason, because it shows us, we would argue, at least, it shows us a level of sinister, conniving intention when someone's thinking about it and trying to execute it. Going back to Immanuel Kant's famous quote, the cool-blooded scoundrel. He said the cool-blooded scoundrel is more dangerous than the erratic one, because he's planning, he's doing this, he's doing that. This guy's more dangerous, the cool-headed one that can think without his emotions. But these intentions are important in case law, and we have seen that to blur the distinctions is going to be difficult. So, are there some things which can never be good? Now, we talked already about Peter Singer and killing disabled babies. Like, can that be justified? And with that, we'll transition to our own system now, the Islamic Sharia system, okay? Because we've kind of covered we've done a lot of kind of consequentialism. We've done utilitarianism and so on. But let's talk about Sharia consequentialism, because there are some principles in usul al-fiqh, in the principles of jurisprudence, which are consequentialist in nature, which assess the consequences. And some of those principles are, for example, ad-dararu yuzal, or that harm is to be averted. It's not like we as Muslims, we don't agree with this. We agree that harm should be averted. So much so that it's a principle in the religion of Islam. And we have dar'ul mafsada muqaddamun ala jalb al-maslaha. This is another principle, which is that warding off that which is corrosive or corruptive or disadvantageous is preferred or put forward above bringing forward benefits. So in other words, in our analysis, we first try and get rid of negative factors before we think about bringing in positive ones. These are all qawa'id, they're all principles in the religion of Islam. We have the principle of mafsada, or the idea of common, not pain, you could argue is corruption. How would you translate corruption? To see if there's any. Maslaha is common interest, on the other hand, yeah? Common interest, what is in the common interest of the people? So we have a lot of consequentialist reasoning. But I'll give you another example, okay? And this is mentioned in an essay of mine that I wrote, and you can find it on kbaish.co.uk, yeah? Because we mentioned this before, corruption, yeah? All right. So, as I mentioned, Al-Ghazali in his book Al-Mustasfa, okay? So just to give you a kind of background of this, Al-Juwayni wrote his book, and then Al-Ghazali wrote his book. These are very important books in Usul al-Fiqh. Mustasfa is one of the most compendious and celebrated books in the principles of jurisprudence in Islamic history. One of the top 3 books, in fact. So much so that Ibn Qudama, he wrote like a mukhtasar, or a summarized version of it, called Rawdat al-Nadhir, which is basically a summarized version of it. But he has a section where he talks about maslaha. He talks about the common interest. And he says, if in order for a maslaha to be muhaqqaq, or in other words, for it to be actually actualized, 3 things must be, look at this, this is very, very sophisticated, that these, even now, consequentialists have not mentioned these 3 principles. And it's very, very, very detailed. He says 3 principles have to be put in place. Number 1, it has to be kulli, which means it has to affect the whole Muslim community, for instance. If not the Muslim community, whoever's living under Muslim rule, which includes Christians, Jews, whoever, yeah? Kulli. Number 2, qat'i. Qat'i means that we are sure that this is going to happen. So, someone could argue we will never know for sure what's going to happen in the future. You could argue, therefore, yaghlibu ala dhannik. It's at least a high possibility over 90%, yeah? And then the 3rd thing is daruri. It has to be a necessity. If these 3 things are not in place, then you cannot judge on maslaha. Now, what's daruri is connected to the 5 things Islam came to protect, which is religion, which is ad-din, nasab, or your nasl even, your lineage, aql, your intellect, your mal, your wealth, and also your ard, your honor. Yeah. So if something is a threat to any of those 5 things, is a direct threat to any of those 5 things, it becomes necessary to avert it, and it fulfills the condition of daruri. So let me give you some live examples, and we have to be careful with these examples. There is an example of tatarrus. It's referred to as at-tatarrus, and he mentions this in Al-Mustasfa. And he says, imagine a situation where there's an enemy army that's going to overtake your thing, and you are forced to use human shields, like from the civilian population. He said, is that ever justified? Now, Al-Ghazali comes to the conclusion that it can be justified in very intense conditions. Okay, he comes to that conclusion. Obviously, there are those who disagree with Al-Ghazali on this point. But, he says, imagine you're in a situation where you're in the sea, and there's maybe 3 of you on the boat, yeah? And the sea is sinking, the ship is sinking. And in order for you to be saved, one of you have to jump off the boat. Huh? No. So he says, is it the question, is it ever justifiable to throw one guy off the boat? He says it's never justifiable to do that. Why? Because it doesn't fulfill all the criteria, kulli, qat'i, and daruri. So it's not in the best interest of all three of them. It's only in the best interest of 2 out of 3 of them, which is 66%. For it to be kulli, it has to be in the best interest of 100% of them. Even though there is discussion about that. Some say, well, 2 out of 3 is the majority, blah, blah, blah. But if there's 3 of them, and he throws 1 out, it's never possible. And we already spoke about, by the way, the situation where if someone said, or rape your own daughter or have sex with your own daughter, otherwise will kill you. It's never, no one has ever said that that's justifiable in Islam, that you have to take the bullet, basically. That consequences will never accept. Rape a 1-year-old, otherwise will kill you. No, I'd rather take the bullet. Because taking the bullet, you can never defile, because it goes, you're taking 2 things. You're taking her honor, the 1-year-old, because she has honor, and you may be taking her life as well. Or even if not, you're really harming that 1-year-old. So these 2 things are in place. So we these are the principles of Islam. We do have a Sharia consequentialism, but it's much more complex and sophisticated, I might postulate, than what you have in the West, which they don't have these principles of kulli, qat'i, daruri, and it has to be this, and it can be working in this situation, and this situation is deontological kind of justification, and this, they don't have that. It's usually either or. It's usually either or. And so we have a combination of both. And for us to be consequentialist, there are criterion that must be met before such consequentialism is justified. Yeah, we talked about the 2 examples. Now, the case study we're going to be talking about today is the age of Aisha. This is one of the most common questions that we find in the Muslim world. Or your Prophet married a 9-year-old. And the truth of the matter is, historically, this is the strongest opinion. That in fact, this was consummated at 9. Is there any other opinions? Yes. I mean, could one, is one a disbeliever if they believe that she was 16 or 18? No, definitely not. Because number one, this hadith is mawquf, which is, it's a hadith which is not narrated by the Prophet but by a Sahabi. It's not marfu'a. And you can have academic discussion, so long it is academic discussion, and it's not trying to moralize. But you're going to find it difficult because it's in Bukhari, for one, and number 2, it's actually narrated by Aisha herself, and in more than one narration. So instead of going down the route of being on the back foot and saying the narration is weak, the real question is, why is it wrong? And why is it wrong? Why is it wrong to have intercourse with someone of that age, say, for example, yeah? Why is it wrong to have intercourse with someone of that age if we believe she's pubescent, etc.? Is it on consequentialist grounds or is it on deontological grounds? Now, there's only 2 options here. Virtue ethics has nothing to do with this. So either it's on consequentialist grounds. So you say it's on consequentialist grounds. So what are the consequences? Harm. We've just discussed harm. Yeah? Is harm a legitimate consequence? Yes. But what we're saying is there was no harm that was done because it was societally accepted at that time. We're saying that the structures of society had things in place for that. And you have to show us evidence, at least from the historical record, that there was harm. And if there was harm, we would agree with you, in fact. And if there is harm, we would agree with you as well. Which is why we don't say that Muslims in this society should go and do that. Because sorry to say, the 12 and 13-year-olds and 14-year-olds of today are nothing like the 12 and 13-year-olds in ancient Athens or Sparta or any medieval time. The structures of society are different. And therefore harm is different. Some of them will come to us and say, well, your Prophet married a 9-year-old. Why don't you marry a 9-year-old? Or why would you allow your marry a 9-year-old to get married? We say no. Why not? Because it would harm her. Why would it harm her? Because society does not support what it used to support. Where you have 10-year-olds in Sparta, you were mentioning it in the previous session, they knew how to fight better than men do now in the American army. We don't have that culture no more. We're living in an age of education, we're living in this and that. So we say if it's a consequentialist reasoning and the consequence is harm, therefore we agree. But we are denying that at that time and that place that harm was there. And we have our arguments for that. What if they say it's deontological consequence? So we'll say you have to now, the burden of proof is upon the one that's making the claim. If this is meant to be wrong at all times and all places, with no exception, no consequential exception, then that must be demonstrated. But then you'll fall on your face if you're trying to demonstrate that, because how can you possibly fall? How can you possibly demonstrate, unless you want to use Kantian ethics? Even then it's difficult. How can you possibly demonstrate such a thing? So on both, it's either consequential or it's not.
What principle would this go against that for? If it's deontological ethics, what principle would they, like, what's the universal principle that's this marriage is breaking?
Once again, the main one that they could argue is harm, but it's then we're back to stage one.
Yeah.
Because the whole thing is, you know, we are denying that at that time, in that place, with that person, at that, you know, in those circumstances, that there was harm, and that we are saying that the burden of proof is the one that upon the one that's making the claim. So how can you prove? Instead of us being always on the back foot and this and that, and say, bringing, you know, a video of some 10-year-old that has had her menstruation or something like that, you know, and she's a big woman now, and there are many of them, by the way. We're not going to say that in this society, we're very clear, you know, on this we have to be very, we're not saying in this society that this applies, because the harm, we can see the harm, psychological, the society is different and so on. But what we are denying is that this is a categorical thing, that's wrong in all places and all times. That's what we're denying. We're denying that it is contextual. Any questions on this point?
Sorry, Mohammed. You know, with this particular argument, I've never heard of any ancient source or any source up until the 20th century where it's been, you know, described as a bad thing.
It's a new phenomenon.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we kind of went through this, if you remember, when we were talking about the age of consent and when it changed in the UK. It was about less than 100 years ago, and it was connected to education. So we can track the historical record on when this thing changed and why it changed. In fact, it was the first wave of feminism and the Marriage Act and the consent and all these kind of things, and they connected it to education, and we can see it. But just because that is the case, it doesn't mean that this becomes a universal moral all of a sudden. You know, it's a very difficult argument to make. And you're right, because I think the first Orientalist to mention this that we come across is David Margoliouth, for example. And this was in the early 1900s. In the early 1900s, where feminism was becoming a thing and where these arguments started to become more and more popular. But like we said before, this was not a universally understood thing, and it is context specific. We are making the claim that it's context specific. If the claim that it's not context specific has to be made, then one has to say that in all cases, at all times, harm will be there, which we know is impossible. That's an impossible claim. You know, that would suggest that in any situation where any one of that age were to do that in any time in human history, that they would be harmed, which could be shown to be demonstrably false. So what we're saying is that in today's age, yes, so we have to be very careful not to conflate the ancient medieval times, and this is why usul is important. Like we're not saying the segmental approach and the decontextual approach to getting a hadith and saying, well, no, let's get the hadith and understand. Does this apply today, now? There's many hadiths where there's slavery things and this and that. What are you going to apply? No, you can't apply. You know, in South London, they were talking about if you get a girlfriend, if you say, you know, get a girlfriend basically, and so she says, I'm your slave, now you can sleep with her. Have you seen this kind of fatwas? These are the kinds of ridiculousness that people come out with because they don't understand the pragmatic nature. And there is a pragmatic nature. Yeah, honestly, wallahi. The pragmatic nature of Islamic... Huh? No, it's not valid. No, it's not. It's not valid. It's not valid by ijma'. Anyway, with that, guys, we conclude. We're going to continue our discussion on this very topic, and we're going to have one team that's going to be asking this very question and one team that's defending themselves, and then we're going to see how it goes. And for those watching at home, I hope you've understood our position and you've taken heed and taken notes, as you should have been. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.